Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that, well, on the surface, it can feel almost like a whisper in the shadows, maybe like some kind of conspiracy theory.
Yeah, something whispered in hushed tones.
Exactly. But as we'll unpack, it seems to be rooted in a very real, very entrenched system, one that shapes far more of our lives than we might realize.
It really does.
Just think about Washington, D.C. for a moment.
Right.
What images pop into your head? Maybe the cherry blossoms, right? The Grand Monument.
Share the classic tourist spots.
Or even those, idyllic tree-lined suburban streets that stretch out around the Capitol. It all looks so normal, serene even.
Deceptively so, perhaps, because that quiet, almost pastoral landscape, it conceals this immense, sometimes unseen power.
A power that influences not just American lives, but really the course of global events.
It's an absolutely striking contrast, isn't it, this city? It's often mythologized,
Yeah.
especially by certain commentators as some kind of radical liberal Gomorrah.
Right, you hear that narrative.
But the reality, according to our source for this deep dive, is that it actually harbors this unique and pervasive military presence.
Which is surprising in itself.
Totally surprising. He compares it, astonishingly, to East Berlin back in 1974, or maybe Moscow in 1979, during the Cold War.
Wow. For a capital in this so-called free world.
Exactly. It strongly suggests that DC's genuine vices, as we'll explore, are, well, maybe of an altogether different kind. More subtle, perhaps, than the popular stories let on.
Precisely. And that's why today we're taking a truly deep dive into this concept of the deep state. We're drawing heavily from Mike Lofgren's work, The Deep State. It's a really fascinating and insightful book.
It really is. Raises a lot of points.
Our mission today is to meticulously unpack this complex, often misunderstood idea. We want to look at how certain powerful forces, often unelected, operating with surprising autonomy work within and around the U.S. government.
How they influence policy, shape outcomes,
Yeah.
exert control in ways that might genuinely surprise you.
Yeah, leaving us to wonder what that truly means for, well, American democracy, and maybe more importantly for your daily life.
Right. How does it filter down?
So, as we start this journey, I want you to think about this. Have you ever felt that decisions coming out of Washington just seem off? Like they defy common sense?
Or maybe they don't quite align with public sentiment, or even what elected officials say they're going to do.
Exactly. Today, we're going to explore why that might be the case. And in doing so, we're going to try and connect a lot of dots that maybe you hadn't realized were even there to begin with.
And it's vital to be clear here. This isn't about pointing fingers or, indulging in hyperbole.
No conspiracy theories here.
Right. Or even claiming some kind of overt secret plot. It's more about understanding the intricate web of systemic incentives, the structures, the relationships that have evolved over decades to shape how power actually works. And our source highlights a very clear symptom of this whole phenomenon: the dramatic decline in public trust in government.
We see the polls.
Oh, yeah. Back in the mid-1960s, public trust was around 75%, pretty high. By 2010, it had plummeted, nearly 80% distrust.
That's a massive shift.
Huge. There was even this, well, darkly humorous but also deeply alarming survey in 2013. It ranked Congress below head lice or cockroaches in public esteem.
Ouch. Though I guess it's some comfort they were still ahead of the Kardashians in North Korea.
Small mercies, right? But seriously, this isn't just abstract stats. It's a palpable feeling out there that something is fundamentally amiss with how decisions get made.
And that feeling, it's only amplified when you look at the economic realities for most people.
Absolutely. Median household income, when you adjust for inflation, actually peaked way back in 1973.
73, wow.
Yeah. And it's been stagnant or even falling ever since for a lot of folks. The 2008 financial crash, it didn't really create new problems so much as it severely exacerbated these long-term trends. It just eroded the American standard of living even further.
So the public feels this dysfunction, they know something's wrong.
Right. They sense it from their own material condition. Yet, the same decision makers, or at least the same types of decision makers, seem to keep getting elected.
Which is the big question. Why?
Exactly. Today, we'll peel back some layers and explore why that enduring paradox exists, what sustains it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start our journey. Lofgren introduces this concept he calls Beltwayland. And it's crucial, right? This is much more than just a place on a map.
Oh, absolutely. It's a distinct political culture, a deeply ingrained state of mind almost, like a unique ecosystem with its own rules, its own inhabitants.
The term Beltway itself, I mean, it refers to that 64-mile highway circling the capital.
Interstate 495, yeah, it really cemented its place in our language during the 1980s, didn't it?
It became shorthand, often used kind of negatively, right?
Yeah, pejoratively. To describe this culture, implying it's out of touch, elitist, often liberal, disconnected from real America, that whole narrative really took hold during the Reagan administration, which saw, really, the first truly mass influx of political operatives who consciously presented themselves as outsiders. They were criticizing this Beltway mindset, promising to shake things up.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The irony of Beltwayland is almost foundational, isn't it?
It really is.
Because many of those same self-proclaimed outsiders, people like Michael Deaver, Kenneth Duberstein, paradoxically, they chose to remain in Washington for decades afterward.
They stayed. As Lofgren puts it rather wryly, they stayed to cash in.
So Beltwayland as this distinct state of mind, this self-perpetuating culture, it was kind of born in that hypocrisy. Opponents of the culture making it their permanent and very financially rewarding home.
It really suggests the system has this incredible ability to co-opt people, even those who initially claim they want to fight it.
It's a powerful dynamic.
Incredibly powerful. And this whole ecosystem, it started shifting even earlier, really, back in the 1970s, with the rapid growth of politically focused foundations and think tanks.
Oh yeah, the think tanks.
Today, the greater Washington area is home to an astonishing 1,600 of these organizations. 1,600.
That's a huge number.
And they're not just, quiet academic places. They bring with them what the source vividly calls hordes of gunslinging grantsmen.
Gunslinging grantsmen. I like that.
Yeah. And despite often trying to maintain this appearance of scholarly detachment or nonpartisanship, they are just as integral to the town's lobbying and influence game as the K Street lobbyists themselves.
So it's not just intellectual debate. It's about shaping policy from outside government, but with huge influence.
Exactly. From a non-governmental yet incredibly powerful apparatus. There was this really telling moment that cemented the shift. It was in 2013. Then Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina, prominent conservative.
I remember him.
He resigned his Senate seat. With 4 years left on his term, he left to become president of the Heritage Foundation, a leading conservative think tank.
And he basically said he could do more there.
He openly stated he believed he could exert more influence over policy at Heritage than as a sitting U.S. senator. Which is, oh, wow, a pretty stark commentary on the perceived power of elected office versus these external, well-funded organizations.
And let's be honest, the money probably didn't hurt either.
Oh, absolutely. That was a huge driver. He was no longer limited by a senator's, $174,000 annual salary back then. The financial incentives to move into this orbit of the deep state are clearly immense.
It really highlights the financial pull, where the real centers of power might be shifting. And you mentioned earlier influences. The ground for shaping public perception, this narrative of Beltwayland, was maybe subtly laid even earlier, like back in 1979.
Yeah, with the C-SPAN cameras finally being allowed into the House chamber.
Right, so you get this visible representation of Congress, even if it's just a tiny slice of the actual wheeling and dealing.
Exactly. It contributes to the public narrative of Beltwayland, this performance for the cameras, maybe separate from the actual power dynamics happening behind the scenes.
Okay, so shifting to the broader cultural landscape, Washington has really changed, hasn't it? It definitely shed that old, sleepy southern town reputation.
Completely. Our source details this really fascinating and quite revealing southward shift of what you might call Dixie's cultural border.
How so?
Well, back in 1960, even rural Maryland, north of the capital, was considered culturally southern. By 1983, when Lofgren first got to Washington, the border was seen as being around the Occoquan River, maybe 20 miles south of the city.
Okay.
Now, it's pushed much further south, at least to the Rappahannock River near Fredericksburg. That's over 50 miles south.
Wow, so that's not just a geographical quirk.
No, it signifies a profound demographic and cultural transformation of the capital itself. It reflects new waves of people moving in, a changing identity that's increasingly distinct from its southern roots.
That's a significant cultural migration. And with that shift, you saw the emergence of these new reigning establishment neighborhoods, right? Yeah. Ones that stand in really stark contrast to the traditional, maybe shabby gentility of places like Georgetown.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking brand new 12,000 square foot McMansion.
McMansions, yeah.
Adorned with, Cast stone lions guarding the front gate, soaring 2.5-story great rooms.
And get this detail, home cinemas with built-in FSB ports.
Yeah. And just to clarify, FSB refers to the Russian intelligence agency.
Which feels like something out of a spy novel. But it's presented as just like a casual design feature.
Exactly. This isn't the old money East Coast look. It's more like a rapidly expanded kind of glitzy suburb you might find near Houston or Atlanta. It signals a whole new kind of power, a really unapologetically opulent aesthetic taking root. It's fundamentally altering the city's fabric.
And tying back to what you mentioned at the start, this militarization of D.C., it's really unique among world capitals, isn't it?
It really stands apart from other capitals in the free world, just
Yeah.
the sheer ubiquity of its military presence.
That comparison to Cold War East Berlin or Moscow is just jarring.
It is. And this omnipresence, uniformed personnel, constant surveillance, checkpoints, it makes that widespread myth of D.C. as a radical liberal Gomorrah particularly ironic.
Right. The reality seems quite different.
The reality is that its actual vices, as the source suggests, are probably far more rooted in the mechanisms of power, wealth, and influence, rather than the kind of moral decay it's often accused of by critics. It's basically a garrison town disguised as a liberal hub.
And this militarization, it's not ancient history, it's ongoing. It actually intensified after the Cold War supposedly ended, right, since the 90s.
Yeah, rather than slacking off after the Berlin Wall fell, the trend accelerated. Defense contractors, many once based far away, like in Southern California, they started systematically relocating their headquarters to Washington and its suburbs.
Like Lockheed Martin moving to Bethesda, Maryland.
Exactly. And not just for jobs, but explicitly to be closer to political action.
So it's about proximity to power, to the decision makers, the information flow.
And, crucially, to the contracts. It highlights how deeply the defense industry has become intertwined with the political machinery. It's created this physical as well as economic nexus right there in Beltwayland.
There's a specific example of this relationship between government spending and local culture. Fort Hunt, right, in Alexandria, Virginia.
Oh, it's a perfect illustration, almost too perfect. From the outside, it looks totally idyllic, like something out of Leave It to Beaver. You can picture the ice cream trucks, the 4th of July parades.
A picture of suburban tranquility.
But, as the source says, looks can be deceiving. This seemingly quiet suburb is home to an extraordinarily high concentration of retired military personnel. You can hardly swing a cat without hitting a retired Army colonel or Navy captain.
Huh. Yes.
In the neighborhood's very existence, it's nice lawns, well-kept homes. It's so heavily dependent on government spending. Mostly military pensions and defense contracts. If the Treasury suddenly collapsed, grass would literally be growing in the streets within weeks.
Wow, that's dependence.
And here's the peculiar irony. This area, with its high percentage of intact, traditional two-parent households, a family structure often championed by conservatives, is financially sustained by the very despised federal government that some of those same conservatives often criticize.
That is a powerful microcosm of the paradoxes in Beltwayland.
Absolutely.
Fascinating contradiction. This outwardly wholesome suburban life, powered by the government some residents claim to dislike. And this blend of power and paradox, it even extends to the city's unique social scene, right? The source calls it.
Hollywood for ugly people.
Right. And it really highlights Washington's peculiar celebrity culture. Beltwayland has its own stars, its own political sham celebrities.
Yeah, figures who get famous not necessarily for, brilliant legislation or profound policy ideas.
But for playing the game, dominating a news cycle, partisan sparring.
Exactly. And outlets like Politico often act like the town's TMZ, reporting on these figures with what the source calls guileless gush and gossipy dishing. They focus intensely on every little snarky comment between senators, every minor political fight, every perceived mistake.
But, and this seems like a critical point from the source, while Politico and similar places are great at covering the small stuff, the daily political drama,
they often fall remarkably short when it comes to reporting on the big things, major legislation or matters of war and peace.
implying that the intense focus on personality and squabbles overshadows the really profound issues.
Precisely. It contributes directly to that institutional void we'll talk more about later. The public gets this superficial view of governing, rather than real insight into the substantive decisions impacting their lives. It's a celebrity culture that kind of distracts from, rather than illuminates, where the real power lies.
Okay, so we've set the scene in Beltwayland, explored its unique ecosystem. Let's finally move to the core of our deep dive. defining what we actually mean by the deep state itself. Lofgren is very clear, isn't he? This isn't some shadowy cabal of conspirators in secret bunkers.
No, not in that sense. He defines it as an American hybrid state. It's an establishment, basically.
Yeah.
A collection of deeply intertwined social networks, all singularly committed to its own enrichment and perpetuation.
So a system designed to sustain itself, expand its influence, driven by its own incentives.
Exactly. And what's absolutely crucial to grasp is its immense scope, financial resources, and sheer global reach.
It's huge.
Lofgren states unequivocally that in these aspects, it's truly in a class by itself. He argues that sheer quantity can achieve a quality all its own. Its power isn't just theoretical, it's practical, pervasive, globally influential.
And it's not necessarily sinister in the usual sense, though it might have menacing aspects.
Right. He argues it's more relentlessly well entrenched. That distinction's important. Its power doesn't come so much from malicious intent, but from its deep institutional roots, its systemic connections, its built-in ways of preserving itself.
Which makes it incredibly difficult to dislodge or hold accountable, or even really influence from the outside.
Right.
Regardless of who wins an election.
Precisely. It's just there. Entrenched.
And for all that power and entrenchment, it's far from perfect. In fact, the deep state has a pretty notable, maybe alarming record of significant failures.
Oh, definitely. Think about the disastrous interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, or its inability to anticipate or properly respond to the 2008 financial crash, which hurt millions.
Even Hurricane Katrina, right? The curious blindness to the obvious potential devastation in New Orleans showed a profound systemic failure.
Absolutely. But what's even more striking than the failures themselves, maybe, is the almost incredible protectiveness toward its higher-ranking officials.
They always seem to land on their feet.
They consistently escape the consequences of their frequent ineptitude. There's this built-in system of impunity. Those at the top face no real repercussions, often moving from one failed project to another with their reputations and bank accounts weirdly intact.
Which leads us straight to one of its defining characteristics, that permeable membrane between government and the private sector, especially in intelligence.
Yes. This isn't just a casual revolving door for a few people. It's a constant heavy flow of personnel back and forth.
And the examples are pretty striking. James Clapper, Director of National Intelligence.
And his predecessor, Vice Admiral Mike McConnell, both top intelligence officials. After leaving government, both became executives at Booz Allen.
And Booz Allen is?
The government's largest intelligence contractor. And it is virtually 100% dependent on government business.
So not a minor overlap. It's a fundamental intertwining of public service and private profit right at the heart of the national security system.
Exactly.
This setup means that these contractors and the people moving between government and their companies are increasingly setting the political and social tone of Washington.
And even more profoundly, they're setting the direction of the country. Yet, and this is crucial, their operations are conducted quietly. Their doings aren't recorded in the congressional record or the Federal Register. They're rarely subject to congressional hearings.
So there's a lack of transparency and accountability for these entities that are so deeply embedded in power, influencing huge decisions about war, peace, surveillance.
Precisely. It's a core aspect of how the deep state functions. It's this silent, pervasive, incredibly powerful influence, operating largely outside the public eye and traditional democratic oversight. It's like a privatization of key state functions, but without the public scrutiny that should go with it.
And this movement of people, the revolving door, it's not just intelligence and contractors, is it?
No, it's a well-trodden highway extending between Manhattan, specifically Wall Street, and Washington, for senior operatives across different sectors.
Figures like Robert Rubin, Larry Summers, Henry Paulson, Tim Geithner.
Exactly. They've all walked that path, moving seamlessly between lucrative financial jobs and high-level government roles, and often back again.
And it's not just about climbing the career ladder, it's about leveraging private sector connections to influence public policy.
And then leveraging public sector experience to enrich oneself back in the private sector. It's a cycle.
Robert Rubin's career is a really powerful example of this in action, isn't it? And the implications it has.
It really is. He went from co-chairman of Goldman Sachs, a financial giant, to President Clinton's Treasury Secretary.
And while he was there, he pushed hard for.
He lobbied assiduously for the repeal of Glass-Steagall, that crucial Depression-era law separating commercial and investment banking, designed specifically to prevent the kind of reckless speculation that led to the '29 crash.
Okay, so he helps repeal it. Then what?
After leaving government, Clinton lauded him as the greatest Secretary of the Treasury since Alexander Hamilton. By the way, Rubin almost immediately lands at Citigroup.
Citigroup, which was formed because Glass-Steagall was repealed.
Exactly. And while there, he pocketed an astonishing $126 million in salary and bonuses.
Get out. $126 million.
Yeah. And what's truly infuriating is that he kept earning this huge sum even while Citigroup was being bailed out by billions of taxpayer dollars after the 2008 crisis, and he did not have to disgorge any of his earnings.
Unbelievable.
It brings us to the stark, deeply disturbing double standard, Lofgren points out. The principle of sanctity of contract was fiercely invoked to protect these executives' massive earnings even when their companies were failing and needed taxpayer money.
But that same principle never seems to apply to lesser fry like hourly workers or municipal pensioners.
Exactly. They often see wages stagnate or pensions cut, despite their own contracts. It highlights this fundamental imbalance. One set of rules for the powerful, another much tougher set for everyone else.
And Rubin was also part of that troika, with Summers and Alan Greenspan.
Right. They effectively crushed Brooks Liborn's attempts back in the late 90s to regulate derivatives, those complex financial instruments that later played such a central role in the 2008 meltdown.
And then, as a final act, President Clinton signed a bill in December 2000 that specifically prohibited derivatives regulation.
He did. He later tried to claim his hands were tied, that he couldn't buck Congress. But a documentary filmmaker who interviewed him called it one of the most amazing lies I've heard in quite a while.
Why?
Because Clinton's own people were actively lobbying for that bill.
Wow. So policy driven not by public interest or even legislative consensus, but by powerful financial interests working through their operatives, all while the public gets a convenient, misleading story.
It's a chilling example of how policy gets shaped behind the curtain, often benefiting a select few, potentially at the expense of the many.
This leads us right into the issue of incompetence and a really shocking lack of accountability within this system.
Yeah, the source gives some truly egregious, almost unbelievable examples from the U.S. effort in Iraq.
Like what?
Get this. A 24-year-old with absolutely no finance background was sent to Baghdad to reopen its stock exchange.
A 24-year-old to reopen a stock exchange.
In a war zone. Yep. What could possibly go wrong? Or consider this. The daughter of a prominent neoconservative commentator, along with a recent grad from an evangelical university, neither with any accounting background, they were tasked with managing Iraq's $13 billion budget.
$13 billion, managed by people with no accounting experience.
Apparently so. These weren't minor roles. They were critical, with huge implications.
It's almost beyond belief.
The source explicitly says this riotous incompetence pervaded the entire Iraq effort. These aren't just isolated stories. They point to a systemic failure. People clearly unqualified put in critical roles.
And the deep state's internal mechanisms then ensure they face no real consequences.
Exactly. And what's just as concerning is the phenomenon of these same former officials, people like John Bolton, Dick Cheney, L. Paul Bremer, even Elliot Abrams, who was convicted in Iran-Contra.
They keep popping up in the media.
Frequently on major news shows, holding forth, justifying their failed policies, and disturbingly often insinuating that holders of other views were unpatriotic.
And the media often lets them.
All before a largely supine and complicit media that rarely challenges their narratives or holds them truly accountable for past failures.
It stands in stark contrast to someone like Angelo Mozillo, right? The CEO of Countrywide Financial.
Oh, yeah. His predatory lending played a huge role in the 2008 crash. And he famously, absurdly, blamed unions for the crisis rather than taking any personal responsibility.
It's like blaming the victim.
The source brilliantly compares this to Wrong Way Corrigan, the pilot who flew the wrong way across the Atlantic, coming back to lecture everyone on aerial navigation. It highlights the sheer absurdity, the lack of humility of those in power deflecting blame for their own catastrophic failures. Accountability flows downwards, rarely upwards.
That's a really powerful analogy. Okay, let's shift focus slightly. How does the deep state actually operate through its financial and political mechanisms? Money in politics, the cash nexus, as Lofgren calls it.
It plays an undeniable, often decisive role. These complex financial arrangements between big donors and key legislators, they don't just impact domestic policy. They profoundly affect critical national security decisions, sometimes in ways that seem to defy the national interest.
Give us an example.
Okay. U.S. policy toward Iran is a prime example highlighted in the source. While AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, has long been a very influential lobby.
Yes, everyone knows AIPAC.
The Citizens United Supreme Court decision in 2010 dramatically amplified the impact of individual super wealthy donors.
Like Sheldon Adelson.
Exactly, the casino magnate. He spent an incredible $150 million in 2012 alone to support Republican candidates, and for 2016, he openly vowed to double that.
Double it to $300 million.
Yep. And the source highlights that his sole political interests are his casinos and the Likud Party of Israel, essentially giving the politicians he funded a short and easy-to-remember checklist for how they were expected to vote on issues vital to him.
So, not subtle influence, it's transactional. Big money for specific policy positions, especially on foreign policy like Iran.
Absolutely. Which makes that candid, almost startling statement by Representative Vance McAllister, a Louisiana Republican, particularly illuminating.
What did he say?
He openly told an audience, almost casually, that members of Congress expect to receive campaign contributions for voting the right way on bills.
He actually said that out loud.
Yep. He even claimed many colleagues view their job not as serving constituents, but as a steady cycle of voting for fundraising and money instead of voting for what is right.
Wow. That's brutally honest.
Wow.
Cynical, but honest.
Extremely. And unsurprisingly, as the source notes, McAllister, despite his candor, got crushed in his party's primary in 2014. It illustrates a painful truth. Candor is seldom rewarded in this system.
It suggests the system prefers its transactional nature to remain unspoken, hidden behind rhetoric.
Exactly. Veiled by talk of public service.
And this systemic influence, fueled by money, it ties directly into what Lofgren calls the self-lobotomizing of Congress.
Yes. The legislative branch, basically, has progressively giving up its fundamental powers, especially its constitutional role in setting spending priorities and declaring war.
And this abdication creates a huge institutional void,
which is readily and eagerly filled by the executive branch, and crucially by the deep state itself, that network of contractors, lobbyists, think tank experts we've been discussing. It's less about them actively seizing control and more about them just walking into a power vacuum that Congress itself created.
And what we often see in public, the partisan fighting, the outrage, that's often just a smokescreen. Political theater.
Pretty much. The outrageous partisan rhetoric and the constant legislative circus, designed mostly to grab media attention and fire up the bases, actually camouflage the deeper truth. Congress has become, in many ways, a largely symbolic institution.
Like the French Estates General before the Revolution. Called together, but with no real power.
That's the comparison Lofgren makes. Congress is often rendered ineffectual, paralyzed. Big issues get perpetually kicked down the road, pushed until after the next election, and the next election is always just around the corner, so they never get truly addressed.
Which effectively means real power has systematically shifted away from elected representatives
to groups that are impervious to elections and largely beyond the control of Congress.
And the stats back this up.
Starkly. Lofgren points out the 112th and 113th Congresses were the two least productive Congresses since records started being compiled in 1948.
Least productive ever, basically.
Yeah. And this decline coincides directly with a huge, largely unacknowledged shift in Congress's historic power of the purse. Remember the backlash against earmarks?
Oh, yeah, the pork barrel spending, like Senator Stevens' $398 million bridge to nowhere in Alaska.
Right. That backlash led to earmarks being virtually eliminated by 2011. The public cheered it as fiscal responsibility, but the deeper consequence was Congress forfeiting power.
So, if Congress isn't setting its own spending priorities anymore, which is what happened when earmarks died, then the critical question is, who is?
The only alternative by default is the executive branch, specifically the often self-interested bureaucracies, and most importantly, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB.
And they now expect their massive budget requests, nearly $4 trillion a year.
To pass Congress largely unamended, this centralizes immense financial power away from elected representatives, who are theoretically accountable to us, the public, and consolidates it within an unelected bureaucracy that's far less visible and accountable. It's a huge shift of constitutional power.
This concentration of financial power, especially in the executive branch and its agencies, leads us naturally to Wall Street's profound influence and its role in what's sometimes called economic warfare.
Absolutely. Lofgren meticulously traces Wall Street's real ascendance to the period right after the Civil War. He links it intrinsically to America's growing wealth worship narrative.
The idea of free markets, rugged individualism, the Horatio Alger myth, rags to riches.
Exactly. It was a time when wealth became explicitly equated with virtue, almost like a sign of divine favor. And poverty, conversely, was seen as the mark of Cain, a sign of moral failure. This was famously promoted by people like Russell Herman Conwell in his incredibly popular 1890 Acres of Diamonds speech.
Which basically argued that opportunity and wealth are all around you if you're just virtuous enough to grab them.
Pretty much, you didn't need to look far.
And this fusion of wealth, business, and national identity really peaked in the 1920s, didn't it?
Lofgren calls it an apotheosis. President Calvin Coolidge famously declared, "The business of America is business." That really captured the spirit of the age.
And you had Andrew Mellon, one of the richest men in America, as Treasury Secretary, literally rewriting tax laws to benefit himself and his wealthy friends.
But it wasn't just influence, it was direct control over the economic levers. And this era also saw that pseudo-religious wealth gospel at its peak. Bruce Barton's hugely popular 1925 book depicted Jesus as a
Up to successful salesman and the very role model of the modern businessman. Seriously.
Seriously. This deep cultural embedding of business interests, positioned as morally good, at the heart of American identity and power, it's striking. And it continues to exert this profound, often unquestioned influence today. It really laid the groundwork for a system where profit is often prioritized above almost everything else.
And this entrenched financial power extends directly to how economic sanctions are used, right? As a tool of the deep state.
Definitely. Sanctions are now an integral part of the deep state's array of tools for coercing adversaries globally. And Andrew Cockburn, a journalist cited by Lofgren, makes a critical point. Getting the big American banks to enforce sanctions is the key to the system.
Why the banks?
Because these banks operate everywhere, globally, and their compliance is driven by intense fear. Fear of massive legal penalties, fear of losing access to the lucrative U.S. financial system if they don't go along with Washington's demands. So financial power becomes a weapon of foreign policy, enforced through the private sector.
But there's that deeply troubling double standard again, applying justice selectively.
Oh, yeah. While foreign banks like HSBC and DNP Paribas have been slammed with billion-dollar fines for money laundering or sanctions evasion,
American megabanks, even those involved in mortgage fraud, robo-signings, selling garbage securities, they've consistently evaded criminal prosecution.
Right. It's a vastly different outcome compared to the savings and loan crisis in the early 90s, where lots of executives actually went to jail. It highlights a system where accountability for financial wrongdoing seems to depend heavily on your nationality and just how big your bank is. The more powerful you are, the less likely you face criminal charges.
And the big question, do these sanctions actually work? Do they achieve their stated goals?
60 years of experience suggests that they do not, according to Lofgren. Sanctions on North Korea, Cuba, Zimbabwe, they haven't brought about regime change or major policy shifts. Often they just harden resolve.
Even Iran, after decades of tightening sanctions.
The government hasn't bowed to U.S. demands, nor has it sparked a popular uprising. A former Foreign Service officer, William Miller, explicitly believes sanctions only made them more defiant.
And the effectiveness is further questioned by the rise of ISIS, right? A well-funded terrorist organization emerging after a book praising Iranian sanctions came out.
Exactly. It raises the critical question of whether efforts to pressure, say, friends in the Arabian Peninsula to stop funding jihadists have been less than completely successful. It suggests a dangerous blind spot, or maybe conflicting priorities.
Which leads to a stark, pretty cynical observation from the source. War is good for business. At least the new American way of war.
Yeah. Economist Thomas Piketty, in his famous work on capital, theorized that large-scale war is one of the few things that historically reduces the accumulated wealth of the rich.
How? Through heavy taxes on wealth and profits, and widespread conscription disrupting things.
Right. That was definitely the experience in the World Wars. Income inequality actually dropped sharply because of shared sacrifice and massive government mobilization.
But the new American way of war is fundamentally different.
Dramatically different. The Iraq War, for instance, was the only large war in modern history fought by a major industrial power that was accompanied not by tax increases, but by a tax cut, even on capital gains.
So war funded not by taxes, but by debt.
By deficit financing and incredibly low interest rates. A combination that then fed directly into an asset bubble, allowing Wall Street speculators to make billions, even as the war itself became the second most expensive in U.S. history.
Creating this bizarre situation where military conflict, instead of being a collective burden, becomes a source of immense private profit.
Precisely. Furthermore, these recent conflicts were fought with a smaller, all-volunteer force that had very little impact on the broader American labor markets, unlike previous big wars that drafted millions and reshaped the whole economy.
And maybe most critically, the war was privatized to an unprecedented degree.
Yeah, corporations like Halliburton handled almost all logistical tasks, feeding troops, building bases, everything.
So the chilling conclusion is
That this new model of war, rather than destroying or redistributing wealth like in the past, would beget even more capital, at least for those at the top of the income pyramid.
it's not just profiteering, it's like a fundamental re-engineering of conflict. The national interest gets tangled up with financial gain for a select few. It profoundly alters the incentives for going to war in the first place,
War becomes a sustainable business model for a powerful segment of the deep state.
which directly implicates the military-industrial complex. Alongside finance, it's one of the largest and most powerful of the special interests, right? Ensuring politicians get plenty of cash through campaign donations and lobbying.
Absolutely. And it's no coincidence, Lofgren notes, that national security spending hit a post-World War II high in 2008, precisely when American living standards were under severe stress from the financial crisis.
That correlation suggests a profound disconnect between national priorities and the economic health of ordinary people.
It really does. And it directly contradicts earlier economic findings from Seymour Melman back in the early 80s. He meticulously showed that persistently high military spending actually depressed overall economic productivity and made defense-related industries less competitive internationally.
And that common claim, the one you always hear, that the military-industrial complex generates jobs.
Lofgren argues it's largely debunked. Defense contracts are incredibly unevenly spread out. Sure, they benefit specific areas like D.C. and San Diego, but for most of the country, it's actually a net negative. People pay more in taxes towards defense than their area gets back in contracts.
Plus the jobs themselves.
Right. That huge sum, $600 billion spent annually on the DoD, generates comparatively few jobs per dollar spent. Why? Insanely high R&D costs and very low touch labor. It's not like WWII mass manufacturing anymore. The jobs created are often highly specialized, need security clearances, and disproportionately benefit a small slice of the population. The economic benefits are far less widespread than advertised.
And the military's reliance on these super expensive gold-plated weapon systems.
That further illustrates this pattern of misallocated resources and, frankly, questionable effectiveness. Take the F-35 fighter jet.
The trillion-dollar plane.
Right. This single program, meant to be the future, has just drained aviation budgets across the Air Force, Navy, and Marines. Yet it continues to face constant technical problems and cost overruns.
And does it even work that well?
Lofgren notes that in a simulated matchup, it performed poorly against Chinese jets, raising serious questions about its combat readiness. Even RAND, the prestigious think tank heavily reliant on government contracts, reportedly backed away from its own study on the F-35's performance under pressure.
So these incredibly expensive systems are maybe too expensive to use in any but benign and controlled environments.
That's the argument. They often sit unused or are only deployed where the risk is minimal. It highlights the disconnect between their massive cost and their actual practical utility in modern conflict.
Which leads us to what the source calls contracting out morality.
Yeah. Back in 1992, Dick Cheney, then Secretary of Defense, started this major policy shift: widespread privatization of many military logistical and support functions.
So having private companies like Halliburton or Sodexo handle catering, that might seem harmless? Maybe even improve the food?
Arguably. But that kind of arrangement would simply never work in a really desperate slugging match like, say, the Battle of the Bulge. And even more critically, combat itself has been increasingly contracted out to private mercenary organizations.
Whose lack of training, discipline, and accountability is notorious.
Exactly. The tragic, deeply disturbing example of Blackwater shooting 17 innocent civilians in Nicer Square, Baghdad in 2007, it's a stark reminder of the profound risks and moral compromises involved in this shift. When you privatize war, you inevitably privatize accountability or maybe lose it altogether.
Furthermore, despite all the loud pronouncements about violent Islamic extremism,
All the indignant huffing and puffing we hear from officials and pundits.
our government's fatal dependence on the monarchies in the Arabian Peninsula for currency stability. The petrodollar system forces leaders to pull their punches when it comes to tackling the difficult subject of ISIS or other Sunni terrorist funding, right?
That's the argument. This economic dependency directly compromises national security policy. It creates this dangerous, hypocritical situation where the need for financial stability seems to override the stated goal of fighting terrorism. It suggests a deeper allegiance to the status quo than to stated principles.
And this continuous, often subtle expansion of military reach also comes with significant geopolitical risks that maybe fly under the radar for most Americans.
Definitely. Few Americans have probably even heard of AFRICOM, the U.S. African Command, created in 2008.
Its headquarters are weirdly in Stuttgart, Germany.
Right. But it maintains this shadowy and secretive temporary presence in most of the continent's 55 nations, including a big surveillance drone operation in Niamey, Niger.
And these deployments, often framed as counterterrorism, are frequently done without full transparency or public debate.
Exactly. Risking unintended consequences, further entangling the U.S. in complex regional conflicts we barely understand.
There's a darkly humorous aspect, as Lofgren puts it, to how foreign policy elites might inadvertently diminish U.S. physical security while supposedly trying to enhance it globally.
Yeah. He cites the U.S. government's ham-fisted meddling in internal Ukrainian politics as having stirred up a hornet's nest, directly risking a new Cold War with Russia.
And such actions, Lofgren argues, haven't just drained our treasury and reduced our international prestige,
but have also destabilized large areas of the world. And the most profound, dangerous consequence, this new Cold War all but guarantees that for the foreseeable future, Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles carrying nuclear warheads will be targeted on Washington, D.C., New York, or Chicago, rather than on Tehran, Islamabad, or Beijing.
Wow, that's a chilling thought.
It is. Our foreign policy elites, Lofgren suggests, often cling to this almost superstitious belief in divine protection for America. He echoes Bismarck's famous cynical quote. It has been said that a special providence watches over children, drunkards, and the United States.
A dangerous overconfidence that ignores the real-world consequences of their actions.
Precisely.
Okay, moving to another critical and frankly pretty unsettling aspect. The surveillance state and what Lofgren provocatively calls the big data fallacy.
Silicon Valley, which already built an entire industry tracking every person who uses an electronic device for commercial purposes.
Selling ads, basically.
Right. They've seen their vast pools of data systematically co-opted by the deep state for intelligence and law enforcement. The line between commercial data collection and government surveillance has become incredibly blurry.
Is this assistance from tech companies voluntary? Or are they forced?
It's complex. Companies certainly have a self-interest in appearing coerced, especially given the widespread indignation over NSA surveillance after Snowden.
Right, bad PR.
But Lofgren makes it clear. Actual coercion is undeniable and very real. He highlights a telling 2007 case where Yahoo faced fines of $250,000 a day, doubling each week.
Or what?
For balking on Fourth Amendment grounds at giving the NSA access to user info without a warrant. That's not a request. That's powerful escalating leverage to force compliance. It shows the immense power the deep state has, even over huge tech giants.
And then there's the fascinating, almost paradoxical figure of Peter Thiel, the Silicon Valley tycoon.
Yeah. Known for his Ayn Rand devotion, his desire for offshore seasteading beyond the law, his blunt belief that freedom and democracy are incompatible.
A self-proclaimed, principled anti-statist.
Yet this same guy built one of his most powerful companies, Palantir, with a $2 million investment directly from the CIA.
From the CIA.
Yep. And Palantir's clients include the NSA, FBI, CIA, even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which bizarrely hired Palantir to spy on inconvenient domestic political groups.
That is puzzling.
Totally puzzling, as Lofgren notes. Why would a tech company trying to cultivate this hippie nonconformity image rely on CIA funding and be advised by Washington insiders like Condoleezza Rice and former CIA Director George Tenet?
It's a perfect illustration of how deeply entrenched even supposedly anti-establishment forces can become within the deep state's orbit, blurring ideological lines in the pursuit of power and profit.
Absolutely. And this pervasive tech integration shows the immense allure, but also the profound dangers of big data.
The entire American approach to warfare, intelligence, counterterrorism, law enforcement, it's increasingly predicated on collecting and analyzing massive data sets.
Yeah. Which naturally hugely benefits the IT contractor selling the tech and services to sort through it all.
There was that example after the Fort Hood shooting in 2014.
Right. Chris Poulin, from a DARPA-funded project, claimed with almost cinematic confidence that the technology exists to predict future events based on language patterns, sounding eerily like something out of Minority Report.
But here's the core problem, the big data fallacy, as Lofgren calls it.
The inherent inability to eliminate false positives. Whether you're trying to predict homicides, suicides, or terrorist attacks, or even targeting suspected terrorists based on metadata. We simply haven't solved the fundamental civil liberties issues because of the limits of human knowledge and the sheer volume of data.
And the default solution, pushed by the contractors who profit from it, is always just more data and more sifting.
Which inevitably leads to more intrusion into personal privacy. It's a vicious cycle. The pursuit of perfect prediction through data leads to ever greater surveillance. Lofgren even highlights that something as benign sounding as suicide prevention requires a near Orwellian scale of big data collection. It blurs the lines between safety and systemic intrusion into our private lives.
This brings us to another powerful tool of control, information classification.
Now, obviously, classification is necessary to protect legitimate national security secrets. But Lofgren argues it has gradually transmuted into a blunt instrument of political control. It's used not just to safeguard info, but also to arbitrarily separate political insiders with access to classified information from the rank outsiders without it, creating this artificial hierarchy of knowledge and power.
And this pervasive secrecy leads to some truly Kafkaesque actions.
Like the chilling practice of retroactive classification, which allows bureaucracies to demote, fire, or prosecute whistleblowers for revealing information that wasn't even classified when they revealed it.
It's insane.
The paranoia reaches such extremes, Lofgren points out, that they require top-secret clearance for their cooks in federal cafeterias.
For the cooks.
Yep. An absurd overreach that says a lot about the culture of secrecy and control. And beyond paranoia, classification is systematically used to shape political debate. Documents showing illegal government acts can be instantly classified just by saying they contain national security info. Then they're redacted into what look like player piano rolls, making any coherent understanding or public accountability virtually impossible.
Creating a clear conflict of interest. When the agency that did the potentially illegal thing, like the CIA, gets to decide what gets revealed about its own conduct.
Exactly. A stark example of this mechanism is the 2008 FISA Amendments Act.
What did that do?
In a move that fundamentally undermined checks and balances, Congress effectively legalized the Bush administration's previously illegal surveillance programs. And perhaps even more shockingly, it indemnified the telecom companies for cooperating in those illegal activities.
How did that pass?
Easily. Just by invoking the siren call of national security and the specter of terrorism, plus the more mundane but equally effective prospect of big donations from powerful telecom companies. It showed how easily fundamental constitutional rights can be sacrificed for perceived security, especially when powerful interests align.
What's particularly notable here is Barack Obama's position on this, right?
Yeah, his trajectory is telling. During his primary campaign against Hillary Clinton, he ran to her left, vocally denouncing the excesses of the war on terrorism, the erosion of liberties. He even publicly supported a filibuster against retroactive immunity for telecoms.
About 10.
Upon the dawning prospect of the presidency, as Lofgren puts it, he abruptly reversed course and voted for the bill.
So had he genuinely grown and become more thoughtful, or did the looming presidency force him to reconsider to avoid offending powerful constituencies that could help or hurt his campaign?
Lofgren leaves that question hanging, implicitly suggesting the latter. It makes you wonder about the true flexibility of political principles when faced with the realities of power within the deep state.
Which brings us to the stark consequences and, frankly, bewildering contradictions inherent in this system's operations. Let's talk blowback.
Right. The unintended, often negative consequences of interventions, especially foreign policy. It's not just a theory, it's a painful, irrefutable historical pattern.
Absolutely. Think about the U.S. funding and arming religious resistance groups against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 80s.
However well-intentioned at the time, that action, as Lofgren notes, created a Frankenstein's monster that little more than a decade later brought the war back to the United States, 9/11.
And the subsequent invasion of Iraq in 2003, far from stabilizing the region.
It spawned further instability across the Middle East, directly leading to the horrific Syrian civil war and the brutal rise of ISIS. These aren't isolated incidents or bad luck. They are direct, albeit unintended, consequences of past deep state interventions. The cycle of intervention and blowback is painfully clear.
And the U.S. government's ham-fisted meddling in internal Ukrainian politics is cited as sparking a new Cold War with Russia.
Yes. Lofgren argues such aggressive actions haven't just drained our treasury and reduced our international prestige, but have profoundly destabilized large areas of the world.
Leading to that chilling potential consequence: Russian nukes aimed at U.S. cities instead of elsewhere.
Exactly. It suggests our foreign policy elites cling to that superstitious belief in divine protection for America, ignoring the real dangers they create for the homeland. That Bismarck quote again.
A dangerous overconfidence.
Yeah.
So what's the broader public's take on all this? We mentioned declining trust earlier.
The stats are stark, showing deep public disillusionment. Trust plummeting from 75% in the mid-60s to nearly 80% distrust by 2010, and that poll ranking Congress below head lice. It really underscores the depth of negative feeling. It's a crisis of legitimacy.
And this distrust is deeply connected to the economic realities most Americans face.
Intrinsically, that stagnant or falling median income since 1973, the 2008 crash exacerbating long-term trends, dropping living standards further. The public knows this from their own lives. They feel the strain.
It leads back to that key question Lofgren poses. The public knows from its own material condition that governmental decision-making is defective, yet the same decision-makers keep getting elected. Why?
It's a profound paradox. It cuts right to the heart of American democracy and speaks volumes about the entrenchment of the deep state.
A question that really forces us to confront the core dysfunction, and it raises unsettling questions about equal justice under law, that motto in the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Thucydides' ancient observation. The strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. Lofgren suggests this might apply with alarming accuracy today, pointing to a profound bifurcation of law.
Meaning what exactly?
That on one hand, a few flamboyant transgressors, usually those with immense power and wealth, are virtually immune from consequences, even for huge actions that wreck the economy or undermine security.
While on the other hand,
The vast majority, the many, face the severest criminal sentencing guidelines. The result, with draconian prison terms looming, most criminal cases end in plea bargains, not jury trials.
even innocent people might plead guilty.
They're often coerced into pleading guilty to lesser charges just to avoid bankrupting legal fees or the risk of incompetent appointed lawyers. Human Rights Watch believes the U.S. justice system has practically abolished the constitutional right to trial for poorer defendants.
Creating a two-tiered system of justice. Wealth and connections, not guilt or innocence, often decide the outcome.
Precisely.
This pattern of impunity and lack of accountability within the deep state shows up in what Lofgren calls the double-down strategy.
Yes. Its instinctive, almost pathological reaction to policy failure is simply to intensify the very same failed policies. Instead of reassessing or changing course, it's predictable and deeply troubling.
The catastrophic failure in Iraq, for example,
Was briefly falsely hidden by the fictitious success of the surge, which then helped justify the surge in Afghanistan, which also, predictably, came to naught.
but undeterred by repeated failures.
The deep state's functionaries then plunged into Libya, causing more destabilization. And the smoking rubble of the Benghazi consulate, a clear, tragic result of intervention, didn't discourage them. It seemed merely to incite the itch to get involved in Syria.
It's not just bad policy, it sounds like institutional stupidity, a systemic inability to learn from mistakes.
Lofgren powerfully connects this to history. State systems with outsized claims to power facing decay or threats often react by just repeating nothing is wrong and calling anyone urging change subversive troublemakers, like the French monarchy before the revolution, the Romanovs, the Habsburgs.
Even quotes Hillary Clinton right from a moment of candor about her own experiences inside the system.
Stupidity was their organizing principle. It suggests this deeply ingrained, almost self-defeating rigidity.
This pattern of internal contradiction is also seen in the populist rights rhetoric, isn't it?
Often, yeah. On domestic issues like healthcare, they might rail against Obama as an out-of-control, unconstitutional tyrant.
But then when the subject shifts overseas,
Suddenly, the same Obama becomes a weak, indecisive, appeasing milquetoast. The glaring contradiction, Lofgren notes, does not matter to their base, because it's largely a dog whistle to rally an angry political base lacking the wit to notice the contradiction.
yeah.
It's about triggering a reaction, not coherent policy.
And this feeds into a predictable pattern for presidential wannabes giving major foreign policy addresses.
Oh, yeah. Those speeches Lofgren describes are often just a word salad of decades-old cliches, inevitably invoking Reagan, peace through strength, emotional appeals to our men and women in uniform, vague calls for eternal vigilance.
A performance designed to reassure and rally, but lacking substance, original thought, or real engagement with global complexities.
Exactly. It reinforces the superficiality of political talk around critical issues.
And the populace, right, Lofgren points out, often carries the baggage of the culture war.
A mania for controlling people's private consensual relations, alongside a habitual conspiracy theorizing about threats like death panels or birtherism.
There's a recurring theme in this backlash populism, often pushed by powerful interests.
That asserts the billionaire and the shoe clerk always have the same interests because both are taxpayers. Both allegedly menaced by parasitic un-American forces, a broad, ill-defined enemy uniting disparate groups against a perceived common foe. It deflects attention from the very real class and power divisions.
The Tea Party's origins, for example, Lofgren calls it a category error.
Yeah, the fundamental belief that the Obama administration's handling of the economy was somehow radically different from Bush's. In reality, Obama's mortgage relief programs, for instance, were mainly intended to foam the runway for the banks, slowing foreclosures just enough for lenders to process them orderly, basically window dressing for the convenience of the banks, not a fundamental policy shift.
Lofgren concludes with political theorist Corey Robin's observation that this kind of populism appeals deeply to people motivated by
the felt experience of having power, seeing it threatened, and trying to win it back. It's a primal cry for control against perceived loss.
So after this extensive and frankly often sobering look at the deep state, its structures, its operations, its consequences, the big question remains, is there an alternative? Are there pathways for change?
Right. Can this deeply entrenched system actually be altered? Lofgren is clear. The problems we've discussed, the distorted economy, the two-tiered justice system, corporate privileges, endless wars, they aren't separate issues.
They spring from a complex of incentives in our system as it exists today, an interconnected web of dysfunction.
Which means to truly reverse the decay of its constitutionally established institutions and stop the transformation into a winner-take-all plutocracy, we have to step back and see the canvas whole.
A piecemeal approach, isolated reforms, won't cut it.
Probably not. It likely won't be sufficient to really change the system. What's needed is a holistic approach, recognizing that changing one part without addressing its connections to others will likely just shift the problem somewhere else.
Okay, so what are some potential pathways? One involves a significant right-sizing of the military and intelligence complex.
Yes. The military, Lofgren suggests, should be sized to defend legitimate U.S. interests. No more, no less. It could make economies without losing capability simply by jettisoning its gold-plated weapon systems.
Those super expensive designs whose main purpose seems to be enriching contractors, not providing real defense.
Exactly. It would mean a fundamental rethink of what true national security is, moving away from a profit-driven military-industrial complex.
And similarly, the intelligence complex could be right-sized
to provide higher quality and more objective political intelligence on foreign events, instead of prioritizing quantity over quality, or worse, abusing U.S. citizens' Fourth Amendment rights in the name of security.
The pervasive surveillance state, Lofgren argues, makes a mockery of being the land of the free.
Absolutely. And the CIA specifically needs to jettison its legion of contract paramilitary gangs and covert troublemakers, because their activities, often shadowy and lacking oversight, are simply not worth the blowback that invariably results. As we've seen painfully over the last 30 years across the Middle East and South Asia, it's time to prioritize long-term stability and genuine security over short-term, often counterproductive, covert ops.
Finally, there's a critical need to fundamentally reform corporate influence and taxation.
Yeah.
Addressing that cash nexus.
Yeah. The disparity in tax laws and enforcement is glaring, deeply unfair. U.S. citizens living abroad face onerous and intrusive reporting requirements with stiff penalties. It makes their lives incredibly complex.
Meanwhile, giant corporations systematically squirrel away hundreds of billions of dollars in overseas tax havens, legally avoiding their fair share.
It's a system designed to benefit the powerful at the expense of ordinary citizens. Lofgren provocatively challenges corporate executives to stop their whining about the U.S. being an incipient Bolshevik People's Republic.
Given that the U.S. has historically coddled business interests for over a century, providing huge advantages.
Right. These executives and their corporations must face a clear choice. If they want corporate personhood, the legal rights of individuals, then they must accept all the legal burdens of a person, including paying fair taxes and being held to the same standards.
And if not, if they keep demanding special privileges and loopholes,
then they must agree to genuine tax reform that doesn't grant them aggregate tax benefits greatly exceeding those of a middle-income wage earner. Otherwise, Lofgren provocatively suggests they're welcome to try their libertarian fantasies in the laissez-faire playground of Somalia.
a stark, maybe humorous, but deeply pointed challenge.
Very pointed.
Wow, what a journey we've taken today, unpacking the intricate, often hidden layers of the deep state. We've explored the peculiar ecosystem of Beltwayland.
A political culture born in hypocrisy, sustained by powerful foundations and its own superficial celebrity culture.
We've meticulously defined the deep state not as a conspiracy, but as a deeply entrenched American hybrid entity.
With immense global reach, yet prone to massive failures and a shocking lack of accountability for its top officials.
We've traced how the cash nexus in politics shapes policy, how Congress has self-lobotomized, creating a void filled by the executive and the deep state.
Contractors, lobbyists, think tanks. We saw Wall Street's rise, its role in economic warfare, and the cynical new American way of war, where conflict strangely boosts capital for the wealthy.
We also delved into the alarming surveillance state, Silicon Valley's complicity, the big data fallacy, and how classification is used as a tool of political control.
And the sobering consequences are clear. Foreign policy blowback, declining public trust, stagnant living standards, a bifurcated justice system.
The deep state's double-down strategy on failed policies reveals a profound, maybe self-destructive stubbornness, echoing historical regimes on the brink.
But we've also dared to look at potential pathways for change, emphasizing the need for holistic reform, military intelligence, corporate taxation. Understanding these problems are deeply interconnected.
So as you, our listener, reflect on all of this, here's a provocative thought to leave you with. If the real power has shifted to other groups, impervious to elections, beyond the control of Congress,
Groups operating in the shadows of accountability, driven by self-perpetuation and enrichment.
then what does it truly mean to be an informed citizen in this landscape? What new forms of accountability might be needed to restore constitutional institutions and address this profound power imbalance?
How do you begin to connect the dots in your own understanding of current events, seeing beyond the headlines, beyond the political theater, to the deeper, more entrenched forces at play? It's a question that demands continuous scrutiny and engagement from all of us.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Mike Lofgren's The Deep State. Until next time.